Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about one of the most unique features of Greek civilization, and that is philosophy. The goals of this video are for you to understand what kind of questions philosophers seek to answer and how they seek to answer these questions. You will also be asked to understand why philosophy was so important within democratic societies in ancient Greece. And for your vocab, you'll mostly just need to know some of the most important early philosophical schools. But before we can talk about any particular philosopher, we need to talk about what philosophy is. Philosophy comes from the Greek words philo, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So a philosopher is just somebody who loves wisdom, and philosophy is the subject in which somebody seeks to attain wisdom. More specifically, philosophy is the attempt to gain knowledge about the world using logic and evidence. Logic is the use of reason and argument to reach a certain conclusion, and observation means using real-world evidence to support your arguments. And so by using both observation and logic, philosophers seek to reach some kind of new truth, something that other people did not know before them. Another important thing is that philosophers refuse to accept traditional or mythical accounts of the world. So the Greek philosophers do not want to explain the world in the same way that their ancestors did. They're not happy to say that lightning strikes are because Zeus is angry. Instead, they would ask, well, what is it really that causes lightning to strike? Is it fire coming down from the sky? Is it atoms swirling around in a particular way? That's how Greek philosophers begin to think. And philosophers are usually busy seeking knowledge about the most profound questions of human existence. And so there are three branches that they spend most of their time thinking about. The first branch is metaphysics, which asks questions like, what is the nature of reality? Where did everything come from? And what is stuff made of? Another category is epistemology, which deals with knowledge. And in this category, people ask questions like, what is truth? And how can I gain knowledge? You're worried about what truth is and how you can somehow get to it. And the third category is ethics. And people in this category ask questions like, what is right? What is wrong? And how do I know what makes something right or wrong? And by asking these different types of questions, philosophers, beginning with the Greeks, have helped to shape our understanding of the world. The first philosophers were also the first scientists. They were the first people to seek to measure and predict the physical world using reason rather than just relying on old traditional stories about how the world worked. So for a long time, philosophy and science were the same thing. What makes the world? What is everything? And because they lived in Anatolia, they had a special advantage of knowing about Egyptian mathematics and Persian astronomy. And because they had been exposed to these sciences, they had a little bit of a lead upon the other Greek city-states. As we already talked about, these guys represent a new form of questioning the world. Their form of questioning is rational, scientific, and materialistic, not spiritual and not mythological. So the first guy in this school, and perhaps the first philosopher that has ever existed, is Thales, who lived from 620 to 546 BC. And Thales believed that everything in the world originally came from water. And somebody who lives on the coast, who lives by the ocean, perhaps that's easy to understand. He believed that at first everything was water and that later the earth and the sky rose out from the water. But he also became a pretty well-renowned scientist and mathematician. He learned how to predict solar eclipses, and he also traveled to Egypt and brought back advanced knowledge of geometry, which he then turned into a systematized activity. Another person from the same city, one of his followers, is Anaximander. And Anaximander believed that it was stupid to say that everything came from water, and instead he believed that things were made up of all different elements, and that by combining these different basic elements, you would get everything you see in the world. So he believed that fire and water and air could combine to make all sorts of different things. He also made some interesting claims, like the sun was 27 times larger than the earth, and he believed that human beings and all other animals were originally descended from fish, that we evolved from these lower animals into these higher kinds of animals. It's pretty interesting that he predicted that. Some other very important early philosophers are Pythagoras and Heraclitus, and they're also concerned with metaphysics, that is, what is everything made up of, what is reality. And Pythagoras, who you probably know from your geometry class, argued that everything is actually made up of numbers. So the physical world, all the stuff we see around us, is not really real. What's really real is the mathematics that lays behind it. And because he believed that mathematics made up everything, he believed that you could understand everything by understanding mathematics. And because of this, he made some very important steps towards a scientific geometry. He didn't make the final steps. This was made by later Greeks, but he learned how to calculate stuff having to do with triangles, as you probably well know, and some other really important mathematical advances. He also created a mathematical basis for music. He believed that music was very important and was really a pure expression of mathematics. And so if you're taking a music creation course right now, you'll know how important mathematics is in determining both like tempo and rhythm, but also the tone of music. And Pythagoras was the first person to figure this stuff out. Another very important philosopher is named Heraclitus, and he believed that nothing is, but that everything is becoming. And so what he meant by that is everything is constantly changing. So to say that anything was this or that was always false. And he summed up this idea with his famous quote, "You never step into the same river twice." So if you think about it, if you step into a river and then you step out of it again, all the water that was in the river originally has flowed past already. And not only that, but it has also taken away little bits of the bank and little bits of dirt and rock and moved it along. And so the river that you were in has already changed instantly. So if you're ever to enter into that river again, it's already changing. So when we talk about a single river, do we really mean that it is one thing? Or is the river rather this ongoing process? Heraclitus believed that everything in the world was like that everything was constantly changing and growing and fading away. But he also believed that there was a natural order that kept everything in balance, so that even though everything was changing, everything would continue to function, and this whole cycle of change would go on forever. Perhaps the most important of the early Greek philosophers were the atomists. And the most famous atomist is this guy named Democritus, who lived around 420 BC. And he was also concerned with metaphysics. What is reality? And he believed that all of existence was made up of tiny atoms moving around in empty space. And the word atom actually comes to us from Greek, and it means an indivisible particle. Atom means unsplittable. So he believed that deep down, everything could be divided up into these tiny little things that you couldn't divide anymore. And he believed that everything could be explained in terms of atoms moving around and combining up with each other. And when he says everything, he means everything. Rainstorms could be explained as atoms. Dogs could be explained as atoms. The human mind could be explained as atoms. He also believed that there was no purpose in the universe, only accidental combinations of atoms. So unlike most other Greeks, he did not believe that gods intended for things to happen, but rather he believed that things just accidentally happened because atoms mixed up in a particular way. He also believed that there was no such thing as an everlasting soul. He believed that the human mind was a product of the interactions between atoms, and that when human beings died, the atoms that made up their body would spread apart, and that the mind would stop to exist because the atoms that made it up were no longer combined with one another. This would be really important because it would go on to influence later scientific thinkers in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. And the last school that we'll be talking about today are the sophists. The sophists are interesting because they're worried about something totally different. The other guys were worried about metaphysics, what is reality? But the sophists were most worried about the question, what is truth? That is, they were worried about epistemology. And so the sophists were a group of people who worked as private teachers, and they would tutor the sons of the rich people in Greek city-states to become great leaders. And the main thing they taught was the art of argument. And this is because being able to argue well was extremely important in a democratic society. Basically, if you wanted to get your way, you had to be able to convince the other people in the democracy that you were right. And so being able to argue well and to speak well and to prove to other people that you were right was how you got things done. And so the sophists spent their time teaching their students how to argue well. Not only did they teach them to argue well, but they actually believed that whoever won the argument actually possessed the truth. And so they believed there was nothing more to truth than being able to convince other people that you were right. This was famously summed up by one sophist with the quote, "Man is the measure of all things." So if you can convince every other person in the world that the sky is orange, then it must be true that the sky is actually orange. There is no truth outside of human argument. So the sophists would teach basically anybody how to argue for or against anything for a particular fee. They didn't really believe in a particular truth. They believed that the truth was the result of an argument. This would really anger later philosophers, especially Socrates and Plato, who we will learn about tomorrow. And so Greek philosophy is important for a couple of reasons. All the guys we've talked about today follow a pattern, and that pattern is that they use reason and argument rather than tradition or myth to understand the world. This is the beginning of scientific thought. Scientific thought does not assume that it knows anything. This is different from myth or tradition because in myth and tradition, people assume they know the answers to the most important questions in the world. The people who believe in mythology know where the world came from, they know how the world will end, they know what happens to the human soul. Scientists and philosophers accept that they don't know this, and then they use scientific thought, that is systematic, rational, and based on evidence to try and come to some kind of answer about these questions. Practically, Greek philosophy led to advances in astronomy, geometry, and logic, and would later lead to important advances in engineering and architecture and other stuff also. And finally, the early Greek philosophers also inspire later scientific thinkers. So, for example, the atomists would go on to inspire the early astronomers like Newton and Galileo, who would try to explain everything just in terms of physical stuff moving through empty space. So that's all for this video. I know I probably went through all that kind of quick. Don't worry about all the details, but just make sure that you can answer these 3 questions and that you have some kind of understanding for these vocabulary terms. We'll talk about it a lot more in class tomorrow.